Hey, what's up? Tim Cant here, and in this video we're going to take a look at atmospheric pad sounds, the kind you might hear in atmospheric DnB and ambient techno amongst other genres. First I'm going to make a simple pad with virtual analog synthesis in Serum, and then I'm going to take a peek at some of the classic pad presets from vintage sampling and synthesis instruments, deconstructing them a bit and finding out what makes them special. If you like pad sounds, then please check out my sample pack, Atmospheric Pads, which is available from Polyend now. 100 fresh pad sounds for $10. They're WAVs, so they'll work with whatever sample playback software or hardware you like, and I've made a video for Polyend on using the pack to make a slamming atmospheric DnB banger on their Tracker Plus hardware. You can find a link to the pack and that video in the description. Also in the description is a playlist of the tracks I mention here, so take a look, why don't you? Okay, let's make a pad in Serum that's just going to be the most basic thing imaginable, just to demonstrate some of the fundamental characteristics of this kind of sound. First up, we want the maximum number of voices possible so that we can play chord extensions without having to worry about running out of voices. Chord extensions are very important for getting that classic Atmo DnB sound, and I'll demonstrate this once our patch is made. Next, I'm going to put long attack and release times on the amplitude envelope. This helps the sound come in and fade out smoothly, giving it a soft feel. We're going to use the default sawtooth oscillator waveform for this sound, which is good because sawtooth oscillators have lots of harmonics, both odd and even harmonics in fact, giving us a very full sound. However, I'm going to activate the filter, and this is important because the sawtooth is going to sound too intense if we don't put low pass filtering on it, and this filter is going to mellow it out. Also, we can modulate the filter cutoff frequency, which will help give the sound movement and prevent it from sounding too static. Also, I'm going to activate filter key tracking so that the cutoff follows the notes that we're playing. As for that modulation, let's set ONV2 to modulate the filter cutoff frequency. I'm going for a really long attack and release with low sustain and a long decay to give me a sweeping sound. We can turn the filter resonance up to emphasize the filter cutoff frequency, which brings out the filter movement and makes it sound more obvious. Currently our sound is in mono and it sits in the dead center of the mix, which isn't really ideal. When I make DnB tunes, I like to have the beats and bass mono for the most part, just sitting dead center, with musical elements sitting in the size signal. So let's widen this pad by turning up the number of voices and adjusting the detune to make it sound nice. As well as widening the sound, this adds another dimension of movement as the unison voices beat off against each other. Currently the pad is really dry, so let's add a touch of delay and reverb. You can of course do this in Serum, but I'm a big fan of Ableton Live's delay and FabFilter Pro art, so I'm going to use those. Okay, so now we have a really basic pad sound, so let's play something with it. Most atmospheric DnB and jungle is in a minor key, so let's play a minor chord. Sounds fine, but it doesn't really have that Atmo DnB feel. However, if we add a minor seventh on top, then we're entering jazzy territory, and this is what makes it sound more legit Atmo-wise. Let's add a ninth too. Good stuff. Not what you want on every tune perhaps, but minor 9 chords really do have that cool jazzy vibe that immediately gives you a classic Atmo feel. Let's add another note, a minor 11. Now, this is probably as far as we want to go, and an 11th chord certainly gives us a lot of vibes, and when you hear it play a pad, it makes you think, oh lovely, I'm going to hear some atmospheric drum and bass. So, what have we learned from this little demo? 1. Long amplitude envelope attack and release gives us a smooth sound. 2. Oscillators with rich harmonics gives us a full sound. 3. Filters allow us to control the intensity of the sound. 4. We can give a sound movement with filter cutoff frequency modulation. 5. Using multiple pan voices gives us a wider sound and more movement. 6. Effects can also give us a wider sound and prevent a pad from sounding dry. 7. Jazzy chord extensions give us that Atmo DnB sound. Of course, there are further things that I could have done to spice up this sound. First, I could have used an LFO to modulate the filter cutter frequency, and you can hear this type of sound in Alaska's The Vortex, which is an absolute belter. Second, I could have added some modulation effects like a phaser to add another dimension of movement, and you can hear an extremely pleasant example of this in the intro to Taylor's Resolution, which has quite a static pad that's really brought alive movement and stereo-wise with some tasteful phasing. So, now you've got an idea of what makes a basic virtual analog pad sound, let's look at some classic pads from back in the day. First up, let's take it back to 1982 and Vangelis's Blade Runner soundtrack, specifically the moody, atmospheric Blade Runner blues. I feel like this is a piece of music that was pretty inspirational for atmospheric DnB producers, and it certainly was sampled a ton on tracks such as JDL's The Runner, Dave Wallace's Blade Runner, and tons more. I believe the pad sound from Blade Runner Blues was created with the Roland VP330 Vocoder Plus, and here I've created a rough approximation with a virtual version of that hardware, XILS Lab V+. I've used the string voices with a low tone setting, some FabFilter Pro R reverb, and that's it. Now, analog is all very well, but where we really start getting to the classic Atmo pad sound is the introduction of digital sampling plus synthesis workstations, such as the Roland D-50 from 1987. Famously used by Enya and plenty of other synth legends, this was the first affordable synth that combined digital sample playback with analog-style subtractive synthesis, and among its presets you'll find some classic Atmo pads. First, we have the Soundtrack preset, which can be heard on tracks like Higher Sense, Cold Fresh Air Remix. This is a fantastic preset that sounds really full playing single notes, but it also works great for chords. Let's break it down. So, like other sampling and synthesis synths, the D50 features a bunch of short digital audio samples known as PCMs that form the basis of its sounds, which allowed them to make harmonically sophisticated sounds relative to analog or FM synthesis. However, the D50 also had a virtual analog synth engine, and it's this that's used to create the Soundtrack patch. The D50's architecture is a little convoluted, so I'm going to keep things simple and gloss over some interface stuff, because otherwise we'll be here all day. So, keeping things as straightforward as possible, the Soundtrack patch uses all 4 voice generators, known as partials, in synthesis mode. These partials can be set to saw or pulse width modulatable square shapes, and for this patch all of them are set to square. If we disable the synth's chorus and reverb and solo each partial, you can hear what each one is doing. I'm also going to use BL Chroma to display what's going on pitch-wise. I'm going to be playing this patch back on C. So, even though we're playing a C, the first partial pitch bends up to G with a bit of vibrato, and then instantly trails off. There's also a bit of filter modulation. The second partial just sticks on G with a bit of vibrato, and there's a touch of low-pass filter sweep on there. Partial 3 sweeps up to C, but the pitch sweep isn't quite as dramatic, and again, it trails off pretty quick. The final partial gives us our solid C foundation that sustains, and also has a bit of vibrato on it. So, as well as the root note of C, this patch is also giving us a perfect fifth interval in the form of G, and there's also that pitch sweep going on at the start of the sound. If we turn off the pitch and filter sweeps, we get a much more plain sound that's reminiscent of the basic pad we made earlier, with a bit of amplitude swell at the start. Let's remind ourselves what the patch sounds like with the pitch and filter sweeps reintroduced, and the chorus and reverb turned back on. It's really a world of difference, despite the oscillators remaining simple pulse waves. Another thing is that the filter envelope depth amount is tied to the velocity, so we get a more dramatic sound the harder we play our notes. So what can we learn about sound design from Soundtrack? Well, it's all made with square oscillators, nothing too fancy there. And the only thing that makes it sound special are the clever use of pitch, filter and amplitude modulation, plus the lovely chorus and reverb. Considering this patch is nearly 40 years old, I think it's an incredible bit of sound design, and it still sounds super futuristic today. Incidentally, this patch, along with some others we're going to look at, was created by the legendary sound designer Eric Persing, the founder of Spectrasonics, who for my money is the pad goat, and you can find a video of him discussing some of his favourite patches in the description. Despite not being a DnB guy himself, Eric has made a real contribution to the genre, so big ups are very much in order. Another awesome D50 pad is Glass Voices, as heard on LTJ Bookham's Horizons. This sound uses a combination of synth and PCM partials, so let's take a listen. First we have the Spectral 6 PCM, which has a touch of vibrato on it. This is tuned down 3 semitones, plus a few octaves from the root. Partial 2 is a square oscillator, which sounds kind of reedy and thin thanks to some filtering. Partial 3 uses the Spectral 1 PCM, sounding kind of aliasy, again with some vibrato. This is pitched down 2 semitones and a couple of octaves. Partial 4 is very similar to Partial 2, again it's a reedy square, detuned slightly against Partial 2 to make a more vibrant sound. This sound really is more than the sum of its parts, with the Spectral PCM waveforms creating a rich atmosphere above the simple synth foundation. Again, an absolute banger, and plug time, you can hear this pad used very tastefully in Soul Structure and Tim Cantor The Rebirth, which just came out on Joysticks. Check it out! Let's move on to 1988's Korg M1 now, a titanic synth with a preset that, at the time, absolutely blew people's minds. Universe. You can hear this sound on, appropriately enough, 4Hero Universal Love Metalheads remix. Being a program patch, this is actually relatively simple, using a mere 2 PCM voices. The first is the classic M1 Choir PCM. This has a bit of non-resonant filter envelope modulation and a long amplitude release time, but that's it, nothing too spicy. The Choir PCM with filter modulation is extremely solid, but what really makes this sound is the second oscillator. This has a big pitch envelope, but if we disable that and play it down a few octaves, we can hear that this is some kind of rhythmic loop that sounds a bit world music-y, I guess, but frankly I have no idea how it was created. It certainly has an awesome sound though. In the context of the Universe patch, it's dramatically shifted up with a big pitch sweep on it, giving it a complex rhythmic modulation that, along with the delay and reverb, really sounds a treat. Spaced Voxx from 1994's Roland JV-1080 is my favourite preset of all time, and its soulful, whispery tones can be heard on tracks like Funky Technicians, Airtight, Funky Technicians, Airtight Remix, JMJ and Richie, Montana, Mooley and Lucida, Prophecy KMC Remix, Omni Trio, Meltdown, Silent Storm Remix, Kudos, East Coast Fusion, albeit with I think some of the tones switched off, and Photech's Cool Track Canine, plus a few more that I can't remember off the top of my head. The 1080 is very much like the D50, apart from there's no straight up synthesis here, it's all PCMs, and Spaced Voxx uses 4 Fairlight style Synvox PCMs, 2 Synvox 1s, a Synvox 2, and a Voice Ooze 1B. These are tuned down an octave, a fifth up from that, on the root, and a fifth up from the root, giving us a big sound that's toned with the judicious use of filter sweeps. The octave down gets a sweeping high-pass filter that makes it practically disappear, especially when played at a low pitch. The rest are low-pass sweeps with some panning to boot. Let's take a listen. The preset also has some multi-stage phaser, chorus and reverb, and the result is so far beyond the sum of its parts, it's not even funny. This sound is pretty big, but played judiciously, it's pure Atmo DnB vibes. A really inspirational patch that once again, despite being 30 years old, is still very much the sound of the future. Pure Tibet is a fantastic JV-1080 pad that can be heard on Q Project the Instrumental and B12's techno-tune GIMP, and it's created using just a single sine oscillator and the 1080's pitch shifter effect. Unfortunately, the plugin version's pitch shifter effect has been broken since launch, which is a real shame because apart from that, it's a decent digital replica of the original hardware. Here's how the plugin version sounds. And here's how the patch sounds coming from my OG hardware JV-1080. Roland, if you're out there, please fix this, as it clearly makes a huge difference to the resulting sound. So, what have we learned from breaking down these famous patches? Well, for starters, there are many ways to make a decent pad sound. Pure Tibet and the Blade Runner Blues patch are quite simple, and still very listenable. Soundtrack and Spaced Voxx are more complex, and feature a lot of dynamic movement. Universe and Glass Voices feature clever use of additional layers over the top of the main pitched elements to create interest. The one thing all these patches have in common is that they use great sounding sources as a foundation, whether analog style oscillators or PTM waveforms. It's also worth noting that they all use straightforward processing to create their sound, just basic stuff like amplitude modulation, pitch modulation, filter modulation, plus judicious use of delay, reverb and modulation effects. Pure Tibet does use pitch shifting, but it's still a very simple sound. So, for me, the main takeaway is that there's nothing too mysterious about these sounds when you break them down. They're just a combination of relatively simple elements that, when added together in the right way, create something transcendent. Aside from the virtual versions of the Roland D-50 and 1080 plus the Korg M1, where else can you get awesome pads? Well, apart from atmospheric pads, out now, link in description, I highly recommend the Roland JV-1080 and Xfer plugins, the Korg Wavestation and Triton plugins, and the unofficial Meatbeats Orbits Plus, which is a sampled version of the EMU Orbit 9090, aka the Dance Planet, where you can find the lush pad from Blame's Revival and Pesce's Jazzlick. Neil's K1V is a great pay-what-you-want plugin version of the Kawai K1, which is ideal for slightly more lo-fi sounds. Gospel musicians have some sweet sampled versions of Yamaha kit. They're not super pad packed, but they do have some cool tones. So check out the TGX85, the TGX99 and Blue Beast. UVI Synth Anthology 4 has some awesome pad patches based on samples from some vintage hardware, including the Korg Trinity. Spectrasonic's Omnisphere 2 is of course amazing and has an awesome library of waveforms and presets, and is a great choice if you're interested in sound design, as its interface is more modern than the Roland Korg plugins that are of course based on vintage hardware. Vengeance Sound Avenger 2 has some nice pads too, and apologies for the cliche, but it really is a Swiss army knife of a plugin that's extremely powerful and definitely worth checking out for modern sound. As for hardware that hasn't made it to plugin form, my top recommendations are the Korg O1W and Korg Trinity/TR Rack version, which has different presets. I'm really hoping we see plugin versions of these soon. Cheers, Korg! Okay, that's more than enough padding it out, and now time for some plugs. If you're a big pad fan, then please check out my forthcoming Chronicle Atmospheric DnB releases, Outer Rings on Ochbron, big up Alex, and an EP on Curvature, big up James ASC. As well as the Soul Structure collab mentioned earlier, there's also a Tim Kant solo single on Jazz Sticks entitled A Mode of Expression coming in the autumn. Big up Paul SG. Also, there should be Vibina hardcore EPs coming on Remix and Endor, big up Glyn Lowercase and Dave Skywalker respectively. Not a lot of pads on those, but still plenty of uplifting noises and slamming breaks if that's your kind of thing. One final plug for the Atmospheric Pad sample pack from Polyend. Please check that out and the Polyend vid. Everything's linked in the description. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you real soon. Ta-ra!